That's a sign that tomorrow is going to be better. But then can we say the same thing about the challenges on this continent? The challenges which were inherited, for instance, by Moussa Faki, the current chairperson of the African Union, can we say that the challenges he inherited 10 years ago or 8 years ago, that those challenges are anywhere near dissipating? My sense is that those challenges have actually multiplied. And if I have to go by his statements at the last AU summit, he actually said the way the institution is structured is in such a way that he cannot achieve anything. And that actually is a vivid confession that the African Union seems to be failing. And this morning, David is currently in Cairo. This morning, the African Development Bank also acknowledged that the way the multilateral banks are structured, that they cannot address the challenges which Africa is facing. So that brings me now to something which Mother Teresa said. Mother Teresa said, yesterday is gone. Tomorrow has not yet come. We only have today. So let us begin the conversation towards building the Africa we want. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles, for starting, and then thank you for those powerful introductory comments. And I'm going now to introduce our first keynote speaker, Mr. David, right now. But before we get Mr. David, I'm going to read his bio, and then I'll give to you, sir. Mr. David is a regional governance and the rule of law project manager at the joint AU-UNDP project called Accelerating the Ratification and Domestication of African Union Treaties, designed to address the challenges and bottlenecks associated with ratification and domestication of African treaties. Mr. David has led the United Nations Development Program, the Regional Service Center for African Program for Governance and Peace and Security Statistics, which supports African Union member states to implement a survey on the status of governance, peace, and security in their respective countries. Mr. David was a member of the technical support team assembled in Dakar from January 2018 to July 2018 to support the efforts of the United Nations to prepare a support plan for the implementation of the United Nations integrated strategy for the Sahel. The support plan has 3 pillars, namely the governance, the resilience, and security. Mr. David represented UNDP to lead on the governance pillar and activities of the governance pillar working group, and by so doing all governance input to support the plan. The support plan was needed to increase the result and the impact of the UN and other stakeholders' interventions in the Sahel region. The support plan has been finalized and endorsed by United Nations Secretary General and the EU Summit at the 31st AU General Assembly, which was convened in June 2018 in Mauritania. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome you, Mr. David Omozuafo. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much, Charles, and happy Africa Day to every one of us. We are happy to be alive today to witness this day and to have the opportunity to reflect on the progress we have made and where we still have challenges and areas where we need to make improvement. So we're happy to be part of this. It's also good that we're having this conversation, not organized by the African Union or any African Union member state, because we all feel concerned, because we all feel we are part of the whole, because we all feel that we have some ideas that we can share on how to improve the work of the African Union and the continent as a whole. So I want to say thank you for this invitation and for this platform for us to have this conversation. And Charles, I think this is one platform we can keep to just, touch base from time to time. A number of policies that are adopted by the AU or regional bodies for us to check, how we are doing and able to advise on areas for improvement. I think this is an important platform that we can keep. Now, let me move on to my line of thought. I was at an event this morning, and when I was leaving, an email message flashed, and it was on where is AU in Sudan. I've not been able to open the full message, but that's the big question. If we have to start this conversation, we can have a whole day talking about the role that AU has played, is playing, or will continue to play to ensure that we have stability on the continent. During the meetings that I've had this morning, two things came out. One, repeatedly I heard fit for purpose, almost everything fit for purpose. The other was about capacity, whether as AU, as an institution, or these regional bodies have the resources, human, financial, otherwise, to deliver on the Africa of our choice. So we will continue to engage in this discussion, in this conversation, to make sure that we have AU that is able to deliver on its commitment. So my reflection, just a few statements on the context where we are coming from, what the AU was made to do, the opportunities that exist for us to deliver on the Africa we want, the risks ahead against prosperity, then the fit for purpose concept and how that applies to the African Union, and then looking at fit for purpose leadership and fit for purpose institution. So that's the way I want to, reflect on this topic, and then end with recommendations on how the leadership of these three institutions, can emerge. One thing we must pay attention to is that we are in a race to deliver Agenda 2063 and the SDGs. SDGs about 7 years from now. So this is the more reason we should be concerned about the leadership of these three key institutions and similar regional institutions. The AU today marks 60 years of existence from OAU to AU. So we are talking about an organization that we should say has attained adulthood, 60 years, matured to be able to take care of its children and grandchildren. And we're asking whether that is what we have. Of course, we know it is not cup half empty. No cup is fully full because you keep using the content. But where we are at the moment, that's what we want to take stock of. AU, as we know it, is the only Pan-African organization with a political mandate, legitimacy, and institutional capacity to develop continental African principles, commitments, and standards. We know how this has been applied to a number of other issues where you have the common African position. So it's a good thing that we have the AU able to mobilize its membership to articulate ideas on how to move together. Why? Because this is one continent in the world whose people bear a strong affinity, emotional bondage, and political solidarity, by the African people. This is one position that Professor Shivji actually has made, because you can hardly pick a country without a link to the next and the next and the next, either in language, either in other aspects of culture, or even political practice, or even the challenges that we encounter. So this is one continent that is naturally bonded together. So we have no reason, not to move coherently. The Africa continent, as we know, has the AU as the oldest and most inclusive regional organization with 54 member states. And it was established, coming into the AU, transforming from OAU to AU, to achieve few things. I think our assessment of whether it has performed well or not should be based on these few things. One, to achieve greater unity and solidarity between Africa countries, to defend the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of its member states, to accelerate the political and socio-economic integration of the continent, to promote and defend Africa's common positions on issues of interest to the continent and its peoples, encourage international cooperation, promote peace, security, and stability, and promote democratic principles and institutions, among other significant goals. So these are some of the few things that the AU was set up to establish. Last year, I think we were all celebrating that AU was able to midwife an end to the Ethiopia-Tigray crisis. But then, before we could put the cap down for celebrating the success of the Pretoria Accord, Sudan, which has been boiling, actually finally exploded. And today, people were asking, should we be celebrating? And what are we celebrating? When from one crisis to another, we are not able to put a finger on what the continental body is able, to predict, is able to nip in the bud, but always taken by surprise when these things happen. Like Charles said from the beginning, we have moved from where we were 60 years ago to where we are now. And thanks to the effort of these continental bodies, especially the African Union, that from the OAU, all the member states have gained independence. They are involved in peacekeeping and trying to deploy the African solution to Africa problems, example of the Ethiopian crisis. From gaining independence to military rule, to one-party rule, to now multi-party democracy, to holding periodic elections by its members to ensure that leadership is by the will of the people, it's not necessarily imposed on the people. Observing elections, that's the AU itself, to ensure that there is compliance with global and regional adopted practices. And the progress that has been made with Agenda 2063, providing clear blueprint on the direction that Africa should go. And of course, institutions and structures put in place to foster integration of the continent. I know that we're all aware of the Africa We Want agenda, an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the international arena. So, what do we need to do to ensure that we have this prosperous Africa, and on what is this based? One, arable land, a large percentage where we can grow crops and feed ourselves instead of go begging for resources on top of our wealth. The large population, youth population. We are told that Africa is the youngest continent. That is a resource, it's not a problem. So we have able hands that we can educate people, that we can send to farm, that we can send to industries, that we can make sure that, they develop our continent. Abundant natural resources, if exploited, such as oil, natural gas, gold, phosphate, and many of them, in almost every part of the continent. How about water resources for green economy? We have water from one end to the other, large ocean bodies, but how many ships do we have taking goods, taking people from one country to another? But that's a huge resource, which in my view is yet to be tapped. And then lastly, still natural resource, sunshine almost all year round, creating potential for renewable energy. But what do we have in most places? Darkness. And without energy, without electricity, we know the impact on productivity. So these are some of the things that when we invest in them, we really can achieve the Africa we want. What are the risks, militating against the achievement of the Africa we want? Even with these natural resources that we have. In the midst of all that, we have poverty, inequality. We have limited access to basic services like health, education, water, and energy. I was checking one website yesterday on the number of universities that we have in Africa. I saw 1,279 universities, private and public, in Africa. That might not be enough, but that's a good way to start, to build capacity, to deliver on the Africa that we want. We have high rate of youth unemployment in the face of these natural resources that we have. Governance challenges and lack of capacity for public service, they are all there. Implementation of the AU program largely falls outside the remit of the AUC. You still have to take the commitment of the member states to make sure that those policies are implemented. If you listen to President Paul Kagame in his report, when he was making that presentation, and how he cried out about the number of policies that have been adopted by the AU, but implementation remains a weak point. The other troubling crisis, I would say, huge debts. I was checking this website, ONE, this morning, and I saw what I will read to you now. There are 21 countries in Africa are in or at risk of debt distress, 58% of access countries. Africa countries owe 644.9 billion to external creditors as of 2021. Africa countries will pay 68.9 billion in debt services in 2023. Debt owed by Africa countries is equivalent to 24.0% of their combined GDP in 2021. So for us to make progress, it's important that we pay attention to leadership. What kind of leadership do we need to push ahead? The last point is poor funding of the union. From the report I read yesterday, I saw the following. In 2014, AU budget, which was at that time 308 million, more than half of it came from the external partners. 2015, 63%. 2016, 60%. 2017, 74%. Possibly by now that maybe has reduced or increased. But this is a concern. With all our resources, with all our assets, that we continue to rely on external funding for implementation of the African Union programs. Now, the fit for purpose concept. I know this is going around, like I said this morning. I was at the ACBF meeting that came up again and again and again. We need ACBF fit for purpose. I was reading, I think, the Paul Kagame's report, President Paul Kagame's report. There was also a reference to AU fit for purpose. I saw a number of other publications, all talking about AU fit for purpose, which means there is something wrong with the current arrangement. So the fit for purpose concept, it's about or presupposes a system, services, organization capable of meeting its objectives. It requires suitable design, implementation, control, and maintenance to be fit for purpose. So I was looking at a report by Elizabeth Legerstedt in her book, Better Business, Better Future, published in April 2022. And she proposed about 5 elements, 5 building blocks of the fit for purpose model. The first is why. Here we'll be addressing higher purpose. Why are we in business? The AU, why are you in business? What do you seek to achieve? Integration, unity, what? What value proposition does the AU offer? And who are the stakeholders? Who do we create value for? And how? What is the operating model? How is value created? And where do we operate? So if we say AU that is fit for purpose, I think it's important to look at its current structure and whether it's able to deliver on the Africa we want. That is necessary. And I think Charles made reference to that earlier. I also saw a report by the World Food Programme on Fit for Purpose, examining its own operations. And they came up with about 5 clear objectives: putting the people we serve first, partnerships, processes and systems, programs, accountability are funded, focusing energy and resources on priorities, providing evidence and accountability for results. To be fit for purpose, there's the need to constantly examine your operations, your structures, whether they have become a huge burden on yourself or whether you are able, like the elephant, pull yourself through. And then applying that to the AU. There is this, well, I made reference to the President Paul Kagame's report earlier, in which I think he maintained that the AU needs to be fit for purpose. So there have been several steps taken, creating opportunity for the fit for purpose to be achieved. One is the transition from OAU to AU. We know from the beginning what the leaders that led, the formation of the OAU, what the argument was. The Casablanca bloc and the Monrovia bloc. One group, that's the Casablanca bloc, wanted an AU united as one bloc, but the other bloc wanted, a gradual integration of the process. Today, we don't know whether we can say we wish we had that Monrovia, the Casablanca approach to it, or whether what we have now is the right or fit for purpose for the Africa continent. But whatever we have the responsibility and duty to make it work. The Constitutive Act of the African Union, Article 4, which shifted from the non-interference to non-indifference. That is promoting the principle of responsibility to protect, so that all the crises that we see around the continent, the conflict that we see, that AU can take proactive steps. And this is where the question that someone asked earlier, where is African Union in Sudan? Where were they with this provision in the Constitutive Act not to have taken the first steps, to prevent what is happening in Sudan? In the past, one could say, yeah, non-interference. But when, with the adoption of the Constitutive Act, we can no longer cite that as an excuse not to intervene or interfere where there is, crisis. Adoption of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, which today is intolerant of undemocratic change of government, of leadership, and calling for compliance with normative frameworks that ensure that the will of the people as provided in global instrument is the basis for forming government. And of course, the ongoing Paul Kagame's report. So we have a number of instruments where the opportunity for reflecting, opportunity for reshaping, the AU has occurred. But the main challenge is not the capacity to set norms, but the capacity, the resources, the political will to implement those norms. Even the report that the president of Rwanda has led, I think we still have challenges from member states to implement all the elements in there. So if we have clear recommendations on how to improve the union, and there is a failure or lack of commitment to implement those recommendations, then definitely we have organization that may not be fit for purpose. Because doing business as usual is not business. I was looking at a report by Jan Verheugen in his paper, the report on Standing the African Union, how to become fit for purpose. And it observes that the peace and security is the sector that enjoys most traction in member states. And this is one area that receives support from all member states. But other areas like agriculture, land management, and the rest of it, not much is given attention. So there is a challenge. So I will round up in a moment. The fit for purpose leadership. Last 2 years now, the outbreak of COVID-19, I think, was a test of the kind of leadership we have around the world, and especially in Africa. Were we resilient? Were we ready for it? Were we predictive? Were we able to, imagine that will happen? So I was reading a report, I think it was actually issued last week, 23 May. The title is Fit for Purpose, the New Leadership Model We Need Today by Alex Liu, Managing Partner and Chair of Kearney. And he says, the past few years have taught us all that some things are simply beyond our control. But lingering economic and geopolitical turmoil have also shown us the importance of focusing on those things that we do have the power to influence. And for leaders, that starts with the culture of our organizations. The old school of top-down no longer cuts in. Instead, a redefined values-based leadership model is emerging, and the focus is firmly on listening, applying, and sharing rather than simply on talking and decision-making. So we should not demonstrate capacity for decision-making. We should be able to implement them. We should be able to listen. Today, he continues, our role as leaders needs to be on fostering allyship, belonging, and culture among our employees, creating a supportive environment that makes them feel empowered to bring their whole selves to work. So in the case of Africa, what do we need? For anyone who is going to head the next leaders of the AU, the ECA, and AFDB, we need a visionary leader. We need someone who can aspire for higher heights. We need someone who is exemplary. We need someone who is agile, who is restless until it is done. We need someone who is compassionate, who is not just leading because of political gains. We need someone with honor, someone we can trace what he has done or she has done before, not just seconded by a member state because they feel it is our turn. We need just leaders, selfless leaders, accountable and inspirational leaders. We need all these qualities because the task ahead is enormous. It's not only with politics that we can push, but we need people who are prepared for the task. So I'm rounding up. I think about 1 or 2 years ago, there was a joint report, well, not a report, a publication by the former president of Kenya and the former president of AFDB. And both of them agreed that Africa needs ambitious leadership now more than ever, both of them. Transformational or transformative leadership is now more urgent than ever before, as we can expect resources to be spread more thinly at this time of greater need. You know, with all the things happening around us, whether the outbreak of COVID, or who knows what is going to be the next, or the Ukraine-Russia war, what is happening right now, freeing up or taking up every available resources. So we need leadership that will be able to look inward and able to say, hey guys, this is where we need to go. Transformative leadership is a holistic balancing act between country-specific needs and context-specific solutions. So these are, you know, the things that we need going forward. But how do we get that? My personal reflection on this, I will close with this. Now, like I said earlier, for the next leadership, it should not be entitlement. Remember the before the current leadership of the AU were postponed due to some challenges, some of the candidates that were presented, and then they had to go back. So I'm saying that we don't need this sense of entitlement. It's our turn to produce the next person. You are not giving us the best in your country, but you are giving us someone that you think is politically entitled. So Africa must aim for the best that the continent can offer. 2, headhunt from both private and public sector, and in the diaspora too. Let the process be open. Interested candidates can apply and present themselves. Let their qualifications and antecedents speak for themselves, speak for them. Provide space for debate. Let the candidate present themselves with a clear plan on how to transform the organization or organizations and transform the wealth of the continent. A program of how to achieve the Africa we want agenda must be presented, scrutinized, you know, defended. Business as usual is not business. For better results, you need to change course. There is a race to achieve SDG by 2030, 7 years from now. Definitely business as usual is not sufficient to do that. So this is why we must disrupt what is there now in the process of selecting the new leaders. The 3 organizations, AU, ECA, AFDB, they must be able to pull through same agenda, same aspiration, you know, approaching it from different ends, but same goal. No institution is stronger than the totality of its members, of its membership. So AU to be strong, the member states will need to do things differently. In the past, there used to be some great leaders with some moral standing that could call others, you know, to order. But today, I think we lack such moral leaders. We kind of have people who are almost all of the same feathers. So we need, from one country to another, the election of credible people. What is only by so doing that you can strengthen the AU. So AU cannot be stronger than its member states. So fix governance in member states, you indirectly fix the AU. Governance deficits in the member states rub off on the AU. So in closing, I want to quote one young scholar who actually published an article 10 years ago, actually commemorating the Africa Day, one Hone Mandefro Belay. And he says, it was a dream of a few statesmen that helped the old Pan-Africanism born in the 60s. It's now time, even long overdue, for a fresh one to come. I close with this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was really, very, very powerful. And at the same time, also giving us quite a lot to think about, giving us a very broad scope of where we are, what should be done, and of course, the call to action for the rest of the continent and the member states in particular. And I'm going to now at this stage, in response to that conversation, I would like Professor Oliver Kapepa, I'm going to give you a platform now, to give us a response to this question, because there's so many things that Mr. David has raised, and I'm going to spread them across our panelists as I invite you one by one. I would like Professor Oliver Kapepa to tell us, in response to the many issues that David has raised, one of the questions that I would like us to explore a little bit more in depth with your presentation is what has happened to the Pan-African dream that our forefathers who started the Organization for African Union had in 1963. Because the challenges that David has raised, it means at some stage we left the rails. The Africa we want is because the Africa we see is not what represents the aspirations of African people. So where did we live? Where did we go off? And how do we get back based on that conversation? So our next speaker, I'm going to give him 15 minutes to share his thoughts. Professor Kapepa. Professor Kapepa is a founder and the chief executive of the Colonnade Business Leadership and the executive director of Entrepreneurship Hub and a visiting professor of entrepreneurship with several universities. He currently resides in Toronto, Canada, and he prides himself as a Pan-African, there we go, an entrepreneur and a passionate scholar. He's also been teaching several universities with many years, and he's the author of The Boiling Cauldron and Other Boiling Points. Ladies and gentlemen and colleagues, welcome Professor Oliver Kapepa. Thank you, sir, for the next 15 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paul. I really appreciate to be present in this roundtable. Let me start by addressing the question that you've asked me about Pan-Africanism that Mr. David, our keynote address, in his keynote address has just projected. You know, being Pan-African is a nice word, is a nice phrase, is a nice brand. We no longer have the Dr. Kaunda, the Julius Nyerere, the Kwame Nkrumahs, that our founding fathers with a very great vision for Africa. They are no longer with us, but they left us a legacy, they left us a guiding tool. But the question is, are we doing enough to follow? My fear is that we are not. Somewhere we have gotten off the train, we have deviated, we have gotten lost. If those leaders were to look into what they are doing right now from their graves, I'm sure they will be unhappy about the direction that we are taking Africa, that the current crop of leaders that we have are taking their Africa too. I just, you know, when I read about their works, I just wish they could have stayed longer to give direction to the current crop of leaders that we do have in Africa. I was asked to discuss the question of, industrialization of Africa. And my challenge with that question was that it's not like we can't do it. The question is, do you have the capacity to do it, right? Do you have the capacity, do you have the goodwill? Do you have the strength? Do you have the stamina to pursue that agenda? Again, my own conviction is that we are not doing enough, right? So we are mourning, we are always mourning about colonialism, we are always mourning about, subjugation that we suffered at the hands of our erstwhile colonizers and so forth, and we can mourn forever, right? But we need to start moving forward. I've observed, Dr. Charles, that almost every country in the world was colonized at some point, but they've moved forward. Not that we should not be able to look back and acknowledge that heinous activities were done on us and so forth. We should do that, but we should do that with hope and be able to move past that and be able to start working. India, look at India. Look at the Asian tigers. They were once colonized, but where are they now? They've moved past that, right? But we are still fighting real and imaginary enemies. Instead of focusing our energies on developing ourselves, on putting ourselves on a pedestal for growth, which is really my. So today we're actually celebrating Africa Day, but we are doing that with much trepidation. We are still wallowing in poverty. Our people are still wallowing in poverty, abject poverty. We are not a happy people. You know, we are still being fed by the West, yet we have everything. So what are we doing wrong is the question, because after we attained our independence in various countries at various stages, I'm sure we have over-celebrated. We've, you know, slept. We often say that Africa is a sleeping giant. Yes, it is a sleeping giant, but to when? Are we going to continue sleeping? Shall we slumber forever and hoping that one day we'll wake up an industrialized nation without doing what we should be doing? We should lift the finger and be able to work towards that agenda. We got the independence, yes, but it's not the everything that we need. We need the whole package. We need the economic independence. So we discovered it too late. When the euphoria lasted for too long, when it was gone, we realized that our country was gone too, our economy was gone too, whether going to the West, whether going to the East, but the economy was gone. It was no longer in our hands. In other countries, it has never been in our hands. 40 years, 50 years, 60 years down the independence lane, we have never really enjoyed the economic benefits of our independence. So how do you start talking about the industrialized agenda, the industrialization agenda, when we are in this situation? So it's time that we start to address, in our quest for industrialized continent, to address the elephant in the room. Do we have the capacity? I'm sure the keynote address speaker also alluded to that question, derived from Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda. Do we have the capacity? Are we fit for purpose? That's what he said. In other words, do we have the capacity to do this? It's something else to have a big vision, but it's something else to walk towards the vision. Are we doing the work? Are you walking the work? Let's introspect on our current realities. How deep are we in this pit that we are? It's very important to acknowledge where we are before we can try to get ourselves out of this situation. We have vast farmlands, but we have hungry people. We are being fed by other continents. We are being fed by the West. That's not the right thing. We have huge resources, but we are poor. We are engaging ourselves in unnecessary animosities. We are fighting for power in Africa. We have wars right now in Sudan, challenges in Ethiopia and so forth. Why are we fighting? We are a divided nation. We are not integrated enough, and we can't move forward in that state. Talk of Afrophobia in South Africa. We hate each other too much. Look at what's happening in Tunisia. Africans against Africans. And how do you begin to walk together towards industrialization, towards the agenda that you've set when you are divided like that? So let's look at this for a moment. Food for thought. Japan has no minerals, but it's one of the richest countries. Dubai is just a sprawling land of sand. Then oil came in 1967, a few years ago, and they've done great work with that oil revenue. We do have minerals and we can't do anything. We have mineral deposits, we have gold, we have uranium, we have lithium, all that, diamonds. But what are we getting? What revenue are we getting? Where is that money going? Why can't you pull those resources together and have something to show for it? What are these other countries doing right that we are not doing? It's time that we look and time that we find our true north. We sometimes tend, ladies and gentlemen, to be too nationalistic. We sometimes tend to be inward looking. We sometimes tend to be selfish as nations. We are too political. We are concerned with the power retention instead of building the economies, instead of being industrialized. I'll give you a case of my country, Zimbabwe. In 1980, when we got our independence, we had some of the best road networks. We had the railroad system that worked. We had water bodies. We had vast minerals. We were manufacturing steel. We were making buses. We were manufacturing buses and military vehicles. We had an efficient, network system, power network system. Where is that all gone to? So we had it all at some point, but it's all lost. What has happened? We are killing our own industries. If you were to walk in some of the industrial hubs in Zimbabwe, they are now ghost towns. We are having we are having factories being converted to churches. That's how bad we have gone. And we are talking industrialization when you are taking 10, 15 steps back. So we need to start moving forward as a bloc, as a continent. We need to start undoing the various tags that we have, the Anglophone Africa, the Lussophone Africa, the Francophone Africa, and they make us work in silos. We have regional blocks that should be working, ECOWAS, SADC, that should be working, but are they being economically integrative enough to include everybody? Or we are working in silos, and it's not a good thing. So if we work in silos, if we work as small countries, our efforts matter not much. Our economies, when they're divided, they can't compete with Tesla, they can't compete with Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon. And we are huge countries, being compared to companies. So our oil, our resources in DRC, in Nigeria, in all those countries in Africa, our resources, if they are not used appropriately, if they're not extracted, if they're not added value to, we remain under industrialized. We need to start moving forward together. We need to start industrializing together, working together to determine the worthiness of our minerals, of our resources, what we have. We need to package it together. We need to process it in here, in our countries, in our continent before we can export it. So the AU agenda should start prioritizing economic issues than power retention. We've seen a coalition of countries around the political issues, protecting each other, patting each other on the back. We need to start calling a spade and be able to point the wrongs that we are doing before we can start moving together as a team, because we have other countries that are weighing down other countries in the continent because of their bad record politically, democratically.
Let's see, Professor Kapepa probably his internet connection has failed him, but I think we get the gist of his thoughts about the need for the African continent as member states to work together and start pulling in the same direction to reclaim the useful space, not only on the continent as an authoritative body, but also around the world and global decision-making processes as far as our resources and their processing are concerned. And it's a sad story that we're so rich as a continent, but most of our resources have to be shifted, to be taken out of our continent to be processed, and then got back to Africa at prices that no African can ordinarily be able to afford them. That's a sad state, and I think it's a very powerful thought to think about on such a day. Going back also to what Mr. David had presented for us as our keynote, there are questions like, what are we then celebrating? If we can still not afford the basics that we have as a natural resource on our continent, that have to be processed elsewhere so that we can be able to gain access to them. So that's a very powerful thought, and I think we get the gist of what Professor Kapepa has mentioned to us. We need to focus on economic issues so that we can be able to tap into the potential that we have as a continent. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think the theme for this year's Africa Day by the African Union is about accelerating AFCTA implementation. And I'm sure one of our speakers will be dealing with that aspect later on. But when Professor Kapepa is speaking about how do we make economic development prosperous for all Africans, I think this is where we need to have that kind of a conversation and start building up that again. So on this building on those thoughts, there's one also issue that was mentioned by Mr. David in his keynote address about the ongoing conflict situation on our continent. And of course, we've come to understand for some time now, much of this conflict is really not even generated by Africans themselves. It's sometimes driven by external forces outside of the continent that have particular interests on particular states and their resources. And I would like us to delve into that angle now, building on that thought as our keynote speaker had given us that food for thought, because we need to be talking about more how do we enhance our capabilities as African Union and Africans to mitigate against these ongoing conflicts, some of them that are not led by Africans themselves. It's something that happens external to our continent. And it's a serious thought because one of the difficulties we experienced in the last couple of weeks on our continent, we've seen what has happened in Sudan. And all of us are aware of the magnitude of the challenge there. More than 400 Sudanese people, our brothers and sisters, passed on or were killed. And almost 1 million of them have been displaced. That is not the Africa we want. But to help us understand these aspects even more concretely, I'm going to invite Dr. Mohammed Suleiman, once I've read his bio, and then he's going to unpack the issue of countering terrorism and mitigating these kind of risks that threaten the Africa we want to co-create. Now, Dr. Mohammed Suleiman is a scholar of African politics and security and an international relations analyst specializing in West Africa and the Sahel region. He has researched and provided expert analysis for the think tanks and media firms such as Foreign Brief in Australia, the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research in Singapore, Australia Strategic Policy Institute, Zambakari Advisory in the US. Dr. Mohammed is a fellow of the United Nations Fellow Program for People of Africa Descent and a sessional lecturer in the School of Media, Creative Arts and Special Inquiry at Curtis University in Australia. Before his current roles, he undertook doctoral studies and a research fellowship focusing on transnational movements and violent insurgencies at the University of Western Australia. He is a multidisciplinary background, and he holds a bachelor's degree in political science, in geography from the University of Ghana, and postgraduate studies in international law from the University of Sydney, and politics and international relations from Macquarie University. Dr. Suleiman has professional experience in humanitarian aid, social work, and international development. He has received specialized training in interfaith and intercultural dialogue, decoloniality theory and practice, strategic leadership, and intelligence. Furthermore, Dr. Suleiman has written extensively on militancy, violent extremism, and counter-terrorism in West Africa and the Sahel, and Africa's international politics and relations. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome and present to you Dr. Mohammed Suleiman. Welcome, Dr. Mohammed, and your 15 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dr. Kariuki, and happy Africa Day again to you all from Perth, Australia. Looking at the outline of speakers, I was under the impression that I was the last part one speaker. So I was waiting to listen to all the other speakers, including Professor Zondi, before speaking. But hey, we should be at the service of Africa whenever we are called upon. I want to start with the question that the facilitator asked initially about what happened to the Pan-African spirit, what happened to the Pan-African movement. And over time, my thinking has been in line with statement made by Professor Ali Mazrui of blessed memory, that post-independent Pan-Africanism was a movement of peoples, but pre-independent Pan-Africanism was a movement of peoples, and post-independent Pan-Africanism became a movement of states and national leaders. So after independence, it's like the zeal of the leaders, the Nkrumahs, the Nyereres, and the Kaundas, and Haile Selassie's wasn't domesticated as to the lower spheres of African experience. Mahmoud Mamdani mentioned that independence deracialized Africa, but it did not democratize it. And here he was also making references to the fact that the people were left out of the liberation struggle. I mean, they were not brought to the center of that struggle. So for me, that is one of the many reasons why we lost course in our Pan-African agenda. Now, specifically on the question of whether the AU is fit for purpose, it is important for us to understand that the AU is operating in an international system that itself is not fit for purpose. What we need is an equal world where all cultures and peoples and institutions and countries are equal and are respected, what Frantz Fanon called a world of reciprocal recognitions. But the world that we live in now is not fit for that. It's a racist world, a racist international system, a world dominated by a few countries and a few elites who look down upon others as inferior. And that is the context in which the AU is operating. Yes, the AU has its own failings, but we have to assess the AU and its activities and progress is made since 1960 and since 2002 when the current version of the organization was inaugurated on the basis of the context in which AU is working. So that is a very important point. And if we understand that, then we need to then come to the question of, is it that African institutions and by extension the AU is unwilling to do all these, to do the things that it's supposed to do, or is unable to do it? Of course, there are, intersections, strong correlation between unwillingness and inability. But even if African institutions have the willingness to do it, they ought to, in fact, they are forced to operate within that system. And if that system itself is not fit for the creation of an equal world, then we must understand that the AU is going to have problems. That is why, for me, I think that the biggest challenge and for the AU is to try, and this is a theme that almost all the speakers have mentioned, to try to, declutter itself of all elements of coloniality. And coloniality, fighting against coloniality here doesn't mean that we preach for an Africa that is at the expense of the rest of the world. But we are looking for an Africa, in the words of Amy Sise, that's in harmony with others. And until that is done, we would always have problems with achieving the Agenda 2063, for example, silencing the guns by 2030. And on that, this is very important for us to remember that this is not the first time that the African continent has had a developmental blueprint or an economic blueprint. We have the Abuja Treaty of 1991, for example. A very good document, but the question is, why did we fail in achieving the aspirations of that particular document? So in as much as we should celebrate the inauguration of these continental developmental blueprints, we should also understand that our success in achieving those aspirations is contingent upon our ability to navigate the system, the structures that we must deal with, be they continental or be they global. We have to navigate those structures, and we have to understand ways of navigating those structures before we would have any significant hope, if you like, of achieving the aspirations. Now, I'll now move on to my specific area of counterterrorism. Now, in the beginning of the 21st century, there were a lot of indicators. Wars in West Africa were ending. Sierra Leone had just come to an end in 2002. Over time, things were getting better on the front of conflicts, such that it was demonstrated by several scholars that the intensity and the frequency of wars in Africa were decreasing, which was good news. Fast forward a few years down the line, African countries, the continent experienced what maybe termed as a jihadist turn in its security landscape, where we had Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and then in 2009 we had the explosion of Boko Haram 2010, and then we had the Ansari rebellion in Mali, of course, connected to the removal of Gaddafi. Since then, what you have is a mushrooming of extremist and Islamist militant cells across the continent, such that in the last 10 years in the Sahel, you have several counterterrorism actors, several counterterrorism responses and programs, and yet insurgencies headed by these militants are winning the war against counterinsurgency. And the question is why, upon all the resources that those who are fighting terrorist organizations have, they are finding it difficult to deal with the issue. For me, the reason is very simple. It is because counterterrorism in the continent is not owned and controlled by Africans. Even beyond the funding, and of course, funding is connected to owning and controlling. The projects, the programs that we prescribe, is within is suffering from a certain strategy of unknowing, where strategies that have worked in the past, in the case of the NPFL of, for example, the Liberian Civil War, these wars were treated in a way that we eventually were able to deal with some of them. IPOMOG, Nigeria playing a very key role in that intervention. RUF, the Sierra Leonean War, came to an end in 2002. But the question is, why haven't we deployed all the strategies that we used in resolving these conflicts? Why haven't we deployed them in resolving this new crop of conflicts? Because these jihadist conflicts or Islamists within a broader system of that is a broader, context dominated, or if you like, subjugated by this global war on terror logic. And what happens is we have outsourced our responses, our ability to, deal with the problem to the West, and such that what we want to do is to defeat the militants and not to resolve the conflicts that they are involved in. So this is why I think the AU on the security front, the AU and its regional economic communities, in this instance, the ECOWAS and others, they are not, at least on this very score, not fit for purpose, because there are a lot of strategies of distraction that are being implemented by these actors. On the global level, global actors, those who have strong interest in the continent, France, the US, Russia, and China, and all those actors, they approach the issue as if those security issues have nothing to do with the system in which we all operate, the system of coloniality, where, you know, the powers of the North actually look down on Africa as sites of exploitation. They treat that issue as if it has nothing to do with history. That is one strategy of distraction. Another strategy of distraction is by the state, where we protect the state, we preserve the state, as if the state is innocent of the conflicts that are happening. So you have the military being deployed, and there are a lot of evidence that the military actually, in the case of Boko Haram, for example, had a role to play in the militarization of the group, which initially was at best less militarized. We also compartmentalize the problem in Africa. Security in general, we compartmentalize it. We feel like terrorism is one issue, poverty is another issue, you know, climate change or environmental degradation is another issue. But the truth is that they are all connected. And so far, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, or counter-extremism, I mean, whichever way you want to call them, have failed to understand that these issues are related. So for me, counterterrorism in Africa is an imposed agenda, one, by the global community of powerful nations on African states. So African states are now doing their bidding, knowingly or unknowingly. I believe it's knowingly and unknowingly both. But inside of the continent, African states have imposed a certain model of counterterrorism on the citizens, such that what the citizens feel and want is not accounted for. That is why the fact that Islamist militants are actually providing security for several communities in the Sahel, for example, is not really accounted for. I mean, we should ask ourselves, why would people accept security from these people that we call the bad guys? You know. So to sum up everything, going forward, I think that the crisis of security in Africa is a crisis of nationhood. And listening to the screen that Professor Sifo-Mandla just shared, we need to have a new conversation about security, about nationhood, about citizenship. You know, and we need to understand that we are one people. You could not be a Ghanaian unless you have interest in Togo, because Togo is just next door, and Nigeria is just next door. We need to have that mentality that Nkrumah went to the OAU in 1963, his speech. I mean, if you read it, it felt like he was a prophet. All the things that he said have come to pass. Now, without taking too much time, let me finish with a statement that Nkrumah made in that particular speech. Just paraphrasing, he said, the people of Africa supported us against colonialism because they felt that an African government or African governments, the independent Africa, will do the things that will give them liberation, that it will do things differently from colonial governments. And Nkrumah warned that if after independence, African leaders continue to perpetuate the problems that existed before, during colonialism, then all this, resentment that the people mobilized against colonialism will be mobilized against the African leaders. And that is what is happening. That is what is happening. If you look at the Sahel, it's clear. So yes, on the security front, the AU is doing its best. ECOWAS is doing its best, but so far, these institutions are hardly fit for purpose. Not that they are not doing anything, they're doing something, but until we acknowledge the fact that we are operating within a system of coloniality, and that system that does not respect us as people and fight for a common cause, that's a world of reciprocal recognitions where Africa is respected, where Africa's resources are, Africans are allowed to, to deploy their resources and their their capacity, their agency to deal with their own problems, will become very hard for our institutions to be fit for purpose. Let me end there, and maybe you have time to have more discussions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suleiman. That is really powerful and insightful. I would like just to pick up on that last thought you've just shared with us. Until Africa is able to really take care of itself in terms of managing its own security situations, so long as we're still depending on international help, we're not going to be able to we're not going to be able to manage the security situation in the countries and in our continent. And I think that's a very powerful thought, because we have a lot of resources on our continent that we do not even have to be looking outside of the continent for that kind of help. But because we have not dealt with the issues that you actually raised, we still feel very much incompetent and unable to really address issues of African challenges, African way. And perhaps maybe it's important for us to be able to explore then, if there is an Africa way of solving these challenges, what is it? Is it also fit for purpose? Can it be able to help us to bring some level of peace and stability in the different countries where we see constant conflicts? I think that builds up to the next idea that I would like us to build on this platform as we continue to deepen the conversation. And then we're going to open at some stage some questions and answer. And I would like to encourage our delegates on the platform, please feel free to share your thoughts and your questions on the chat box. I'm going to get to those in not so long from now. But I would like us to talk now, since we're talking about the issues of counterinsurgencies and terrorism and how these things have influenced the way the African Union, for example, and other bodies on the continent are responding to these issues. I'd like to pick up also a thought that was mentioned earlier on by Professor Kapepa around issues of migration, and talking about the drivers of these issues that has really, of course, become synonymous with our continent. Africans are labeled to a great extent that they hate themselves. And what I came across just a few months ago, a book titled "What's Wrong by Being Black?" and all kinds of things, because sometimes we portray ourselves as people who really do not value who we are as a people. And that has necessitated sometimes unnecessary migration within the continent and inter countries, and creating all kinds of pressures and around migration management practices. And I would like to bring in now at this point to take this discussion further on that trajectory, Ms. Achieng Maureen Akena, and I think she's going to be speaking to us around why, for example, we do not have a comprehensive framework for working with member states to mainstream human rights and service deliveries and migration management of those who are very vulnerable on our continent. But before I do that, I'm going to read her bio, and then we're going to give her the platform to really address that question and share with us her thoughts. So Ms. Achieng Maureen Akena is the Executive Director at the International Refugee Rights Initiative, and she has unfettered passion and commitment to human rights advocacy generally, and with the vulnerable groups in particular, as well as a wealth of knowledge and experience in strategic leadership, institutional resource management, and advocacy networks in the international institutions at global and continental level. Mr. Achieng has about 20 years of experience in the promotion of democratic governance in Africa and advocacy in the protection of human rights of the marginalized people globally. She holds a master's degree in international human rights law from Oxford University in the UK. And prior to joining RRI, Achieng was Executive Director of the Center for Citizens Participation in the African Union, the Pan-African Citizens Network, and she has, among other engagements, served with the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan, as well as a human rights officer in 2008, and with the African-led mission to Mali as a human rights observer in 2013. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you, Ms. Achieng Maureen Akena. Welcome, Ms. Maureen. Thank you. We are unable to hear you. Maybe you should increase volume on your end. We can still hear you. Try again. We still cannot be able to hear you. Maybe there's something with your network there. We still cannot be able to hear you. I think she will rejoin again. While we are waiting for Ms. Maureen to join and give us her insights, I want to bring in now, while we wait for Maureen, she will give her the round when she comes back. I'd like to bring in Ms. Patience Samusa. I think she's here on the platform to talk about her thoughts about the inter-African trading that can help us to facilitate better migration. That's one of the challenges that I think has been experienced by the continent. And the African Union has been pressing around, better migration policies management. And now I would like Ms. Patience to come in at this stage to be able to.
Okay, sorry.
Yes, I would like Ms. Patience to come on this while we wait for Mr. Ching to connect. But we will.
Moderator, just letting you know that I am back. Apologies for that.
Oh, okay. All right. So after Mr. Ching, we'll have Ms. Patience to come on board. All right, go for it, Mr. Ching. Right.
Thank you very much, moderator. Kindly allow me to keep my video off. I think it may be interfering. I tried to go out and come back in, and I hope now I can be heard better.
Now we can hear you better. Yeah, go for it.
Fantastic. So I guess my answer to your question is probably because our governments are only aspirational. I think the problem is that they only seek to meet our aspirations as Africans, and that our plan for 50 years is based on aspirations. Someone once told me that even the name African Union is an aspirational one. How African is our institution if it's the EU that funds it and China that houses it? And how much of a union is it when countries continuously refuse to defer their sovereignty for the common good? While as Africans, we're dealing with life, our governments are dealing with aspirations. And more often than not, the mechanisms that are set up are based on aspirations instead of the realities that we live. Take, for instance, this is the year for accelerating the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was mentioned by one of the former speakers. And while the Free Trade Area has more than 44 ratifications, the Freedom of Movement Protocol, which is a sister document to the AfCFTA agreement, has only 4 ratifications and is not yet in force. So I guess the aspiration in that sense is that goods and services will walk themselves across the borders, perhaps. If we think of Pan-Africanism as being the need for Africa's solidarity and self-reliance, and as being a prerequisite for our emergence in the international arena, as we have aspired to do in Agenda 2063. Pan-Africanism was a people's project before it became a governmental one. Back when Kwame Nkrumah could not get the attention of heads of state and government, he called the people, and the All African People's Congress preceded the establishment of the OAU, at least 2 of them. Now, with all the challenges that we had on the continent, the heads of state and the leaders at the time decided to invest in creating an institution which had the ability, capability, and resources to respond to the needs that we had as a continent and as Africans, to respond to all the challenges as we converted what were essentially economic units into political ones, as we sought to build nations and provide the services that our people needed and deal with structural adjustment programs and so forth and so on. We put millions of dollars into the AU, which I like to call our, and I own it, our multi-million-dollar institution. However, somewhere along the way, we got forgotten as the people. The building and development of this multi-million-dollar institution has erased the role and effort of Africa's people and their citizen formations. I mean, they won't even let us into summits anymore, despite contrary aspirations of union driven by people rather than governments, of us being the focus and the center of this Pan-Africanist institution. They won't respond to growing human crisis that pervades the continent. Millions of Africans are food insecure, facing insecurity and instability, trapped in protracted conflicts. But Africa continues to outsource its responsibility, or African governments continue to outsource their responsibility to their own people. Take the instance of Sudan. Even where we have failed on the peace and security front, surely we have an African humanitarian agency that should be mobilizing and providing leadership and responding to the hundreds of people now dying from starvation and trying to survive in inhabitable places. So if you ask me, is the AU fit for purpose? I would say absolutely. Institutionally, legally, morally, even aspirationally, if you like, we are fit for purpose. We have an entire peace and security architecture whose sole purpose was to ensure that Africa has the ability to adequately respond in a multifaceted way to the kinds of crises and situations that we are seeing on the continent. And it is not as if we have done this before. I get frustrated when every time a conflict arises on the continent, it's like we're starting from scratch. It's like we forget that we've been dealing with conflicts for the past 50 or so years. So by now we should be throwing the rule book at everybody. We should be providing our expertise in Ukraine rather than starting almost like zero from Sudan, with Sudan. We have done this, we know how it's done, we know how it's done properly, but each time we reinvent the rule book, we don't do it well. When I was studying, we had a plaque on, I studied in India, and we had a plaque by Dr. Ambedkar on our college wall. And what it said was that it doesn't matter how good a constitution is, if those who are called to make it work are bad, it will be a bad constitution. Similarly, if it is a bad constitution, it doesn't matter. If it is a bad constitution, if those who are called to make it work are good, it will be a good constitution. And I think similarly, the problem for me with the AU is that those who are called to make the AU work are not fit for purpose. They are failing to utilize the full extent, resources, expertise of the African Union, and are in what my colleagues, Chidi calls a risible non-response, and Don calls a posture of calculated ineptitude in relation to the crises that are occurring on the continent. We saw what I call a youth negotiated in relation to Ethiopia. And now we are seeing more inaction in Sudan, which for me is unjustified. The AU had already suspended Sudan. It had already said it does not recognize the legitimacy of the two generals. So what has stopped the AU from responding appropriately to this situation? Why is the AU twiddling its thumbs and outsourcing its responsibility towards the protection of Sudanese? These are the issues that I think we need to be asking ourselves. The institutional framework is there, the resources exist, the experience, the expertise, it's all there. So why isn't that translating into a better life for Africans? And I'll give just one last example, Chair. The AU has been talking about alternative sources of funding for the last 20 years. Several meetings and discussions later, and the AU is underfunded more than it ever has been before. Does that have to do with the external actors? Or should we, for some of these things, should we be asking ourselves questions as Africans? Thank you very much, Chair. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ching, for that powerful, insightful conversation. And I think you've raised very powerful questions that really need to be grappled with on this platform by all our speakers and delegates in attendance, starting with the last comment about resource mobilization. And it is indeed not so good to celebrate a continent that is so much endowed with resources, both finances and others, and still dependent on the global North partners to still help us to make our life possible. That is just not on. And I don't think in any ways one would want to be celebrating a day like this with that kind of a background. And it's very sad even to know that as much as we celebrate that the member states have joined the African Union as a body, why are they not willing to put their money where their mouth is? And so I think you're raising very powerful questions around that. And I also think the idea of outsourcing our responsibilities is a leadership question. So when we talk about fit for purpose, it's this kind of things that we need to be grappling with. Surely, what could have really influenced our leadership on the continent, and especially of our institution, to be able to not go beyond the stuckness? Because it seems to me from an outside perspective, there's some level of stuckness of not able to transit beyond the challenges that they've had since inception, of persuading member states to invest in an institution that gives the continent the decision-making capabilities to be able, for example, to influence the developmental path that we want to take as a continent. And of course, to be able to address these other challenges like human rights issues, the rule of law issues, the trade issues and others, that we need to have our voice first before we are dictated to by a partner that's outside of the continent, most likely unfamiliar with the context. I like your thought around, aspirations. That's very powerful. I think it's a tweetable thought there. While our leadership on our continent is enjoying aspirations, African people are grappling with realities. That's very powerful. Thank you so much, Mr. Cheng. And on that powerful note, I would like to bring in Ms. Patience, because I think there is a trail of thought right there following each other. Knowing that one of the challenges that our continent has been grappling with is fast-tracking the policy intents that we've come up with, or the continental leadership has come up with. One of them is ACFTA. I think at the point when it was inaugurated and mentioned and even launched, it was a celebratory moment. But we've not seen a fast-tracking for all kinds of reasons, of facilitating that agreement into a way that is tangible. I think one of the things one would have expected to be celebrating on such a day is how fast that agreement has been, implemented, and how it's facilitating with tangible results the inter-African trade with tangible results of saying that it's addressing issues of unemployment, it's addressing energy issues. Before I joined this forum this afternoon, one of the technical glitches was because I just came from load shedding. Here in South Africa, living in darkness has become synonymous with our lives. And so I just come from that load shedding, and therefore connection was a problem. Why should we be talking about issues of energy deficiencies when we have such richly endowed, like Brother David said in the beginning in his keynote address, we are endowed with natural resources like water bodies. Some of our African countries have huge water bodies that they could be sending or sharing or selling, if possible, some of their energy into us? Why would we have to run to the Global North partners to help us with our energy and pay millions of dollars that we actually hardly have, because we're actually borrowing that money to pay them to provide security? These and other issues I would like Ms. Patience to really explore them, because especially from a trade perspective, and hear her thoughts about, if we are to talk about taking stock, where are we as far as facilitating inter and intra African country trading is concerned? Is the leadership of the African Union providing sufficient impetus to get this agreement on the go? Now, before Ms. Patience takes over, I would like to read her bio. And Ms. Patience Amusa is an inclusive business and markets development expert with over 17 years of experience working in agriculture, energy, and waste management sectors, facilitating market access, value chain development, enterprise development, and private sector engagements within Africa and globally. She has been instrumental in providing institutional capacity building, coaching, mentorship, and advisory support for a number of NGOs and CSOs, including government institutions, as well as small and micro medium enterprises in several countries in Africa. Ms. Patience is a holder of an executive master's degree in business administration and a Bachelor of Science in agriculture and natural resources management. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Ms. Patience. Ms. Patience, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Paul. So my apologies, my network has been putting me in and out. So my topic is, was trying to look at the green industrial revolution in the wake of what has recently happened. Like when you're looking at the recent COVID pandemic, we are also looking at the Ukraine-Russia war. So some of the things that I was just taking note of was just looking at those, like when you look back and say what has caused that, like when you look at the Ukraine war, how it has caused the global shock. So it then made me think to say, what do our leaders need to think about when it comes to those shocks? They are real, they will come. We have been just recouping from the COVID-19 pandemic, but again, we're just affected. So this then calls for us to have a relook at how we are treating agriculture. I really like the keynote address that have been put across, that when you look at most of the African leaders, what they are prioritizing is peace and war, but they don't know that agriculture
Right, it seems like the internet connection from Ms. Patience is not helping her to stay on the platform. And while we wait for her, I'm sure she's going to rejoin. It has been kicking her in and out all the time. But while she's trying to get that connected, I'd like to bring in Mr. Emmanuel Benza on the platform to share his thoughts based on the conversations we've had and also issues of African CFTA. I really want to hear your thoughts about that agreement and how far have we gone since we are taking about stock. We're taking stock this afternoon, looking at the challenges that we've experienced as an African people in trying to fast track these kind of agreements so that they can become beneficial to all of us and give us what we're looking for. Africa, the one we want is an Africa where prosperity is shared by all. So before Mr. Emmanuel takes off the platform, I'd like just to read his bio. Mr. Emmanuel Benza is a Deputy Executive Director of the Accra-based ACFTA Policy Network with responsibility for African Union programming and outreach. He's a comparative regional integration expert with technical expertise and practical experience in advocacy and communications from Brussels to Addis and Accra. He works for the African Union Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, coordinating a group of communicators from the Communications Network to help amplify APRM's work, and is a member of the APRM at 20 Task Force. Mr. Benza has been a member of the Agenda 2063 Media Network since 2018, and is very well versed of Agenda 2063 and is versed in ECOWAS and African Union policy analysis, having published an e-book on ECOWAS and AU peace and security in 2019. He is actively consulting for Arusha-based Pan-African Lawyers Union on a stakeholder mapping project of ACFTA ACTES. Mr. Emmanuel, would you take over the platform for the next 15 minutes? And then we're going back to Ms. Patience. Thank you so much.
Yeah, hello. Good afternoon, Dr. Kariuki. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, sir. Good afternoon to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I think after listening to all the fantastic insights over the past hour, I think I would gladly bow down, or rather bow out. But I think I'm compelled to make a contribution, so I'll do my best to do so. Around the freedom of movement, I think I like the topic about assessing the AU's and REC's leadership drive for free movement of people, goods, and services, and the missed opportunities. Let's briefly talk about the background. I think the freedom of movement is cardinal to any regional integration project. I think we're all very well aware of that. I mean, you cannot talk about regional integration without talking about freedom of movement, people, goods, and services. The EU is often held up as a model of the freedom of movement because we know what it's been doing with Schengen since 1985. We also know that the EU is quite a seamless market for freedom of movement of goods and services. What people forget is that during the COVID crisis, and even during the crisis when it was hit by terrorism, they were almost very eager to close down the borders to contain some of these challenges. Conversely, in ECOWAS, which has had a freedom of movement that predates Schengen since 1979, despite COVID, despite terrorism in the Sahel, I think the leaders have never felt that they have needed to close the borders, which for me goes to suggest that they believe that in West Africa, Africans are largely a people who like to move. So irrespective of the crises, the terrorism, climate change, and all these other crises, I mean, it is not the closing of the borders, stifling of freedom of movement that is going to help make progress on the other fronts that we're seeking to make. So for West Africans,
you're muted, Mr. Emmanuel. Hey, Mr. Emmanuel, can you hear me? Hello, Mr. Emmanuel, can you hear me? It seems like, oh yeah, there we go.
And freedom of movement for about 10 or 15 years prior. We now know that we will come back in 1999 and 2000 for a second shot at integration after the many squabbles between Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, and so on and so forth, and try and reignite East African integration with all the old things that had predated the collapse in 1977. But largely, the freedom of movement was always going to be an important part of East Africa's integration. Just the other day, 2 days ago, Uganda started having conversations with DRC, one of the new members of the East Africa community, on freedom of movement, waivers, visa waiver deals, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a testament to East Africa's continued commitment to freedom of movement, which is a good thing. We also know that in IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which was set up in 1986, largely to deal with droughts and development, has moved beyond droughts and development to more developmental-oriented issues and also security resolutions, more of a security actor in the Horn of Africa. And we see that it's been doing that. It's also been fairly active on freedom of movement, to the extent that now Kenyans do not need a visa to go to Addis. And I think there are discussions among the members on Djibouti and so on and so forth. So there's been a lot of progress on freedom of movement. And we cannot talk about trade without freedom of movement. And when IGAD launched its trade policy document in September 2022, a large part of that also had a section on freedom of movement, which is central to the conversation on trade as well. Because goods and services, as we have said elsewhere, do not move on their own. They always move with people. And so this brief snapshot of how the RECs have been handling freedom of movement, starting with ECOWAS, a bit about EAC, IGAD, gives some hope that freedom of movement continues to be central to the conversation on Africa's integration. On a day like this, it is important to reflect on the progress that we have made. However, the challenges still remain. Back in 2006, when the AU held its 6th ordinary session in Banjul, the idea was to use that AU meeting to rationalize the regional economic communities. So in the rationalization, they came up from 16 groupings to around 8. So the 8 RECs that we have known since 2006 have been ECOWAS, COMESA, SADC, ECAS, SENSAD, Arab Maghreb Union, EAC, IGAD. Now, a few of these RECs in an age in which we make a lot of noise about the African Continental Free Trade Area, we realize that are not really fit for purpose. SENSAD, for example, which was set up by the late Gaddafi, Libya, is not functioning as it should do as a proper quote-unquote REC. So the conversations on freedom of movement there are virtually moribund. Arab Maghreb Union, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, they spend the better part of their time fighting among each other, that they have not really sat down to have conversations on what do they do about freedom of movements. I understand that they have visa arrangements, but as to the freedom of movement that we see in West Africa and East Africa, that is not predominant in the Arab Maghreb Union. In Central Africa with ECAS, I think they've done a bit better, but there's still work to be done. At one point in 2014, I remember that ECAS, the United Nations tried to bring ECAS and CEMAC together to rationalize those two communities to find out ways in which they could have important conversations of freedom of movements. I'm not quite sure whether 9 years down the line, what has happened with that conversation, whether the UN has left it for the two Central Africa-based regional institutions to find solutions on that than it is in Arab Maghreb Union. Now, this is for the brief roadmap or overview for the RECs. I think we cannot remain as positive about the African Union's Freedom of Movement Protocol. To date, 4 countries have signed, which include Rwanda, Sao Tome and Principe, I think Mali, and there's another country, I think Chad. These are not the typical countries that you would expect to sign a Freedom of Movement Protocol. Ghana hosts the AFSA Secretariat. One wonders why the country that hosts the AFSA Secretariat has well and it has well and truly signed the Freedom Movement Protocol, but has not really bothered to make any efforts in ratifying the Freedom Movement Protocol, which is a mystery, considering the roles that Ghana plays together with Nigeria in ECOWAS, and how it values it at the regional level. And you're wondering why it feels that at the continental level, it is not that important. So for ratifications, it's egregious. At the time when in 2018, when the Freedom of Movement Protocol, together with AfCFTA, was happening, and we now have like 43 ratifications for the African Continental Free Trade Area, and we are wondering why we still have this terribly low number for the freedom of movement of the AU protocol. I think something needs to give. One of the things in our discussions at AfCFTA Policy Network that we had with IOM, which we have an MOU with, was that why don't we just come up with an envoy, a champion, like we've had for other things like AfCFTA, which was the Niger president. For the African Medicines Agency, we had Michel Sidibe, who largely made great effort in rallying around the low-hanging fruits of countries that had not signed nor ratified the African Medicines Agency. And he was able to use his star power, so to speak, on social media and outside social media to mobilize member states and get the magic 15 within a couple of months. He was hired, I think, by the AU in 2021 or so, I think around April, as a special envoy for the African Medicines Agency. Within 3 or 4 months, we had seen tremendous progress where he had reached the magic number of 15 ratifications. And the ratifications continue, not with the same speed as when he was special envoy, but at least they continue to be made. And I think the bottom line is that he has been able to get the magic 15, which is usually needed to for ratification and to operationalize an AU agency. And so you look at examples like that and you're wondering why there are best practices that we see in things like what happened with the African Medicines Agency, and yet we are not seeing the same best practices applied to the Freedom of Movement Protocol. IOM tells us, I've heard them speak in other spaces, that there's been some progress on identifying a champion. I'm not quite sure when the champion will be found. When a lot of member states very quickly always become champions of causes you wonder how they became champions of. I'm not quite sure what the problem is around the Freedom of Movement Protocol, reason for which the ratification is so slow. And failing the identification of a champion, I'm also wondering why there aren't other strategies that we can look at that may be able to support the idea to help fast track the ratification of the Freedom of Movement Protocol. So in assessing the
EK, your microphone is off.
Right. Emmanuel, it seems like your microphone is off. You've muted yourself. You can hear us. Right. It seems like Emmanuel has been cut off. Let's hope he's going to get back. I see patience is
in publications looking at the way forward of freedom movements. These two regions, ECOWAS Parliament, for example, together with East Africa Legislative Assembly, could come together and serve as ambassadors for the AU's Freedom of Movement Protocol to help rally around the low-hanging fruits, the member states that are reluctant to sign but who could quickly join, and also rally around those that are difficult in signing freedom of movement protocols, such as those in the north, in the Horn of Africa, who have security challenges and therefore would feel that signing the freedom of movement protocol would have security complications for their country. So I think there's a lot of missed opportunities associated with the freedom of movement protocol that are now only beginning to bear fruit as the African Continental Free Trade Area ratifications continue to increase. It's interesting to see that now that the ratifications are hitting almost 50, we continue to see more member states, more citizens talking about the fact that the freedom of movement protocol is important, remains an important part in the conversation on AfTA. Personally, I think that there's a lot more that we need to do. I'm quite encouraged by conversations that I've heard in different spaces. For example, in March, there was a conversation that the Africa Open Skies and the SATEM, the Single African Aviation Transport Mechanism, which would allow for open skies for member states, airlines, are now seeking to link that up with the Freedom of Movement Protocol and IOM as technical partners, as well as AfTA, to see what they can do. So the conversation on that is underway. I'm not the purveyor of this idea, but I do know that that kind of dynamic is happening. And I understand that June, July, or August or so, a lot more movement would have been made on that, using the example of the fact that the African Commission, the Civil Aviation Commission based in Dakar, which is responsible for African aviation safety and also piloting, supporting the African Open Skies, another Agenda 2063 project, is seeking to fast track the African Open Skies with about 17 or 18 member states, and therefore use the African Open Skies as an opportunity to rally around the conversation of freedom of movement and help fast track that conversation as well. So I'm quite encouraged by that development. As to whether it will happen as quickly as we want, I think the jury is out on that one. But I think the fact that stakeholders are thinking around what they can do, what else they can do beyond a champion or a champion for freedom of movement is encouraging. And so in that respect, I think that we can look forward to better days on what we need to do in seeing the freedom of movement protocol make progress. Nonetheless, the reality is before us that for ratification still, even among the much noise that has been made by citizens and other stakeholders alike on the need to make progress, we still see 4 ratifications. So I'm not quite sure when we're going to move from 4 to at least 10 or 11 and get to the magic 15, which would help operationalize the freedom of movement protocol. Because I think at the end of the day, we make a lot of noise around AfTA, forgetting that goods and services do not move on their own. At the end of the day, it's going to be a conversation around visa-free regimes, plus open skies, plus freedom of movement, and whatever else that is connected to these things that is going to make the difference to AfTA. AfTA cannot make progress on its own without some of these aspects being factored in the conversation. And so in closing, I'd like to end on the fact that all is not lost. Let's keep the faith, but let's also remember that this is a very critical year. This is 5 years since AfTA agreement was signed, 5 years since the Freedom Movement Protocol was signed. We need to be serious, and we need to be confrontational about the challenges bedeviling member states that compel them not to want to sign and ratify the Freedom of Movement Protocol. We need to begin to name and shame, if necessary, on why they are keen to ratify the Freedom of Movement Protocol, but they don't want to do anything around that the African Continental Free Trade Area, but they don't want to do that on Freedom of Movement Protocol. Finally, as someone who also works with the Africa Peer Review Mechanism, I can tell you that there's a meeting coming up sometime in the third quarter around migration, and there's going to be an important conversation on Freedom Movement Protocol. Now, APRM is the AU's agency responsible for good governance in the spirit of Aspiration 3 of Agenda 2063, which calls for good governance of member states and so on. And I can say on authority that that meeting, the character of that meeting will be one characterized by conversations around what APRM can also offer with its technical expertise on ensuring that member states do the needful to help fast track the Freedom of Movement Protocol. So I think that is what I can offer for now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Emmanuel. I think those are very useful insights about what needs to be done, and really to pick up one of those powerful talking points on how regional economic blocs can be able to work together to facilitate member states adopting and signing of the Freedom of Movement Protocol. It's not okay that we still do not have as many countries as supposed to be, signing off to make sure that there is free movement on our continent. So thank you so much for those comments. On this stage, I would like to re-invite Ms. Patience. If you can hear us, please continue with where you left for the next 10 minutes. We are really running short of time and we need to be rounding up. So go for it, Ms. Patience.
Okay, thank you so much. So yeah, I'm sorry about that. So I was just reiterating like the importance of agriculture to the African economy. So we're saying we've been hit by COVID, we've been hit by the Ukraine war. These are some of the things that have disrupted the food and energy supply. And it also means like if our African continent was relying more on exports, it means this has also been disrupted. So that calls for our African leaders to have an urgent look at agricultural policies, regulations, and strategies put in place to promote food self-sufficiency. Because I was just looking at this, if all borders are closed and we are relying much on imports, I'm based in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is importing a lot of food from South Africa, and that then meant when COVID came, Zimbabwe couldn't import anything from South Africa. So what should then our African leaders focus on? So that means we need to call for some urgent action, looking at that transition where we need to start prioritizing agriculture as a very important tool to transforming our nation. So I was just looking at the contribution of agriculture to the African economies. So Africa on its own, just quoting from the World Bank data reports, it contributes about 35% of the continent's GDP. And it also provides for food and income for more than 50% of the continent's population. So that then means if it's that important, I was just comparing it with what other countries are offering. So our contribution of the agricultural sector is quite higher when compared to other continents. So that then means our African leaders need to take serious cognition of the agricultural sector. But when I then looked internally to say what's happening in our agricultural sector in Africa, it's the least developed. And then when you look at the sector, it's largely dominated by smallholders who are producing mainly for their own consumption, and they're not producing at scale to also meet the export demands. So when I was then reviewing this, this then calls for urgent action by our African leaders and also the African Union and also the people that are funding the agricultural sector to have a critical look at this. Then the other issue that I noted was we had to then dig deeper and say, okay, if our agriculture is like this, what is the context like that you're operating in? So the realities that we saw is that most nations are faced with increasing population pressures. Then there's also significant levels of poverty and inequality in Africa. We also have got rapid urbanization and the people that are skilled. I think the keynote address talked about the number of universities that we have in Africa. So why are we not food secure if we have got technocrats, people who are good at food security, or we have got people that are good at everything? So the brain drain, if those people are then moving out and developing other nations, what then happens to Africa? So we need to start looking at internally, how do we start retaining our skilled labor so that it can benefit our nation? So those are some of the questions that we need to make sure we also table at the AU leadership. So some of the challenges that the agricultural sector is facing, we're looking at the issues around climate change, the high input costs, the low investment in agriculture, the shortage of farm worker, and I was also looking at the inappropriate policies and regulations that have been put in place that are then impacting negatively on our agricultural sector. Then our presidents have tried and address this by either promoting subsidies, but what I've noted with most of those subsidies, either they are not smart. In the end, what it does, it creates dependence on our African leadership. So if we are to have a real look and seriously look at this, then it means that we need to call for internalized solutions to try and address some of the food security gaps. Then I was also looking at the price controls that are put in place by different governments that then cause disruptions of operations by the private sector. The choice of crops not also taking into consideration the realities of climate change. And also it doesn't prioritize localized agro-industrial development. So when I was just looking at this, what does Africa need to then promote food and self-sufficiency? So I was then thinking critically and say, my grandmother, she died at the age of 87 years, but she was able to feed, like, she had 10 kids. And she had 150 grandchildren, but she was able to feed all of them from a small plot. So what good did I learn from her approaches? So she had mixed cropping systems. She had a number of things that I'm also going to allude to that we need to learn of taking it from that level. So Africa is abundant land, which we need to have a look at. Then the weather is also very conducive for production of crops. There's also huge potential for transformation of the agricultural sector if we take it seriously, given its contribution to GDP and also livelihoods. Then we also have got ready local markets that we can also take advantage of. My colleague has also talked about the Industrial Revolution, how it can also contribute towards having our own internalized solutions. So what I was then looking at is what does our African leaders need to have a serious look at? So given the challenges that I've talked about, so it means that our African food systems need to be diversified. And then we also need to take into consideration that we need to start looking at resilient value chains. If we are going to commercialize our agricultural sector, we need to look at climate smart technologies that do not harm the environment. Then we also need to look at inputs. Learning from my gogo, she used to have a lot of manure that would be generated from a cattle that would then be inputted into her fields. So she didn't buy much. So looking at that, we can also, our African leaders can also learn, rather than just buying synthetic fertilizers it's also an issue of how do we manage waste that's being generated internally and then use that productively to also promote our agriculture. I was also looking at misappropriated investments that are being made to the agricultural sector. If you look at them, I've worked for development agencies for a long time. So when you look at most donors that are funding Africa, they've got predetermined conditions to say this is how we should be doing things. But we say probably that should be the reverse. We should be telling them what we need for and what works for us and start investing in irrigation. I think those are some of the things that can also lead to improved productivity. Then one other issue that I've noted, being a value chain development specialist, it's also looking at the role of multi-stakeholder platforms and attacking, coming up with solutions from a systems perspective rather than just looking at one point. You need to look at the agricultural sector as a system. So some policies, if they're enacted in one sector, it means they can conflict another if they're not looked from a systems perspective. So those are some of the things that we need to really take seriously. Then the Africa Development Bank also needs to prioritize like investment in irrigation. I think that one, it's an urgent need for. Then we also need to make sure, they also need to make sure that if we are irrigating, we also don't deplete our natural resources. So that also calls for a lot of investment in how we manage our water reserves and also the natural resource base. And also the issues around technology. I think this also adds to to what my predecessor has also talked about agro-industrialization. We need the right technology, the right equipment that can also allow us to increase productivity per given piece of land. I was also looking at the potential for value-added products. All our products are going raw. We are not adding any value to our, then we then buy that. So we can also do a lot of value addition internally. I was also looking at the problem faced by most nations is the rural to urban migration. So if we create decentralized agro-processing centers within those, they can also help in creating employment at the local level. That then also decongest the increasing and rapid urban population that we have. Then we also need to...
Patience, would you please round up for a minute?
Okay, so the other issue that I've also noted was we have got a lot of waste which we can then start commercializing and then look at organic fertilizer production, so that at least then the issues around renewable energy, I think those are the urgent issues that we need to, so as to support our agricultural sector. So in closing, what I can say is our agricultural sector, the AU needs to take it seriously. It has got a huge contribution to so many livelihoods and to so many people in rural areas, in urban setups. So we need to take it seriously and treat it as an urgent need for intervention and also funding to support it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Patience, also very powerful insights of how the continent led by African Union can be able to support the continent to be food secure. And I think policymakers should have you as their advisors. I think these are very powerful insights that they need to take into consideration and help our continent to be more healthy than it is right now. And of course, it begins with policy leadership and be able to facilitate the implementation and securing of the necessary resources from such an institution like the African Development Bank to be able to facilitate the implementation of these policies that require significant revenues. Lastly, but not least, we're going to have Professor Spamantla Zondi joining us and sharing his presentation around how continental leadership has failed to see how our education systems and curricula fail to contribute to the solutions and the challenges we are talking here this afternoon. and of course, how this has perpetuated some level of confusion and weakened our capabilities of commanding respect from the global space. And of course, even among Africans themselves, which is not right. Our continent is not short of expertise. Our continent is not short of leaders who can make things happen, but there is something wrong about how we are going about our education processing and the curricula to prepare all of us from creche, so to speak, up to postgraduate education, so that our system can be able to turn out competent human workforce that is able to respond to the challenges that we are experiencing and provide innovative and creative solutions to it. Before I give Professor Zondi the platform, I would like to read his bio. Professor Zondi is a professor of politics and international relations and director of the Institute of Pan-African Thoughts and Conversations at the University of Johannesburg here in South Africa. Professor Zondi was executive director of the Institute for Global Dialogue, IGD, from 2009 to 2016. He received his BA, Bachelor of Arts and Higher Diploma in Education from the former University of Durban, Westfield, before graduating with a Master of Philosophy and Doctor of Philosophy in African Studies at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. Prior to his current position, he headed the IGD's program on African Studies and South African policy analysis for 5 years. Between 2000 and 2004, he coordinated the African Institute of South Africa. Between 2000 and 2004, he coordinated the African Institute of South Africa's Regional Integration and Sustainable Development Programs. Professor Zondi has published widely in his areas of research interest, namely regional integration and governance, South Africa's international relations and foreign policy, and public health policy. He is a leading scholar in conversations about redesigning Africa's curriculum to fit Africa's context, explain African realities, and offer solutions to African challenges. Additionally, he's a member and advisor of the presidentially appointed South African National Development Planning Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to you, Professor Zondi. Thank you so much, Prof. Good to see you again.
Yes.
Go for it.
Yeah, Abarigan.
Salama.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, my dear brother. I apologize for the length of the resume that Charles was able to draw from somewhere. The most important thing would have been that Siphamandla Zondi is a researcher who's trying to think about the progress for Africa. Everything else, secondary. Allow me to just make 6 points. I know we're just out of time. The first point I just want to make, recognizing what everybody else have said, is that knowledge is power. We've said this for a long period of time, that knowledge is power. And therefore, knowledge is perhaps what we would use as a tool to cause the change that we need. If we're going to change the economy, if we're going to change food security, if we're going to change climate change, if we're going to change the capacity of the state, if we're going to change the ability to implement everything, if we're going to change the nature of leadership, we're going to change the nature of citizenship, we're going to change the nature of a public servant we have, if we're going to change anything about Africa, we're going to have to change it at a level of knowledge, because knowledge produces for us the kind of mentality we need. Secondly, because knowledge produces for us the skills we need. Because thirdly, knowledge produces for us the attitudes we need. Fourthly, because knowledge produces for us the capabilities that we need. And lastly, perhaps knowledge produces the character and the type of a change agent that we need. And without these intangibles, whatever you do, whatever good policies you best, you can elaborate it and all that, but without the capabilities, none of these things will ever be achieved. And Africa's biggest challenge in the past 60 years has been the kind of capability we have produced in order to translate the vision, great visions we've always had, into reality. And that is the biggest challenge. Oftentimes we have thought that could come from the oratory of great leaders. We had them, the Mugabes, we had the Nkrumahs and all of that. That didn't change a thing because their oratory was not equal to their capability. Sometimes we thought the qualification of leaders, we've had leaders who have 3, 4 PhDs and the best of engineering and all that, but that did not translate to change. Sometimes we thought that is a powerful and a strong leader who lasts longer, and we thought it could do. We have had the longest serving leaders, longer than Helmut Kohl's stay in power, but that has not produced the change. Sometimes we thought maybe the youth leader. Sometimes we thought maybe the woman leader. We've had any of those combinations, but it has not produced the change, because in the end, it is the type of knowledge that leader produces, that part of knowledge that society produces, that is going to produce the leader needed, the public servant needed, the institution needed, the citizen needed, and that whole combination is what that's going to produce the change we are looking for. So that is the first point to make. And therefore, the second point becomes, therefore, for us to produce the Africa we need in all of these things, the Africa we want, to produce all the aspirations we've had, both the Pan-African ideals going back to the early 1900s, or the recent one, the Agenda 2063. All we need to do with that is to think about what we're going to do with knowledge, and how we're going to use knowledge to produce all the tools we need to produce the society that we need. That knowledge will be formal, that knowledge will be informal. And therefore the translation of the gene, the harnessing of the thing to produce what we need, is going to be at the level of the knowledge that we have. Thirdly, we have to, we know it, we have to produce at least 3 conditions through this knowledge. One, we have to produce a cadre of citizens that is needed for us to produce the Africa we need. And we often talk about leaders, leaders are poor here and leaders are poor there. We hardly ever realize that it's actually the citizen we have that produces often the outcomes we see. Because the leaders are themselves a product of a citizen we have. I like using the example because of the crudest of example of Charles Taylor, who had been a huge challenge and part of the militarization of the whole of West Africa, caused problems for Sierra Leone, for Liberia, and for the entire region, and caused a lot of problems for all of Africa. And then when it is time for elections, converts himself into a civilian. It is the citizens of Liberia at the time who say, he killed my father, he raped my mother, yet I will vote for him. Why? Because he was an orator. He was handsome. He knew how to present himself. He didn't place himself in power. It was the citizens who overlooked everything about him that was a failure. In South Africa, we had a leader who was problematic before he was elected. It was called Jacob Zuma. Yet people voted for him knowing that he was going to fail, but voted for him early. So there's a problem with a citizen who is a voter before they become a citizen. So this is a citizen who think their citizenship is the ability to put a mark in the right space on all that. But that citizen is not yet a citizen. It's a voter before he becomes a citizen. Because if he was a citizen, he would think many times before doing the voting. So it's not the ability to vote that is a problem, but it's the ability to think about Africa and place the interest of Africa before what he prefers. The ability to vote for people he doesn't like, as long as they are the people who can do the job. But we have this kind of a voter who votes with his heart. I vote for this one because he comes from my ethnic group. I vote for this one because he speaks very good English. I vote for this one because he knows how to tell us who are the problem outside. I vote for this one because there's oratory. But we don't have a citizen of that. We secondly need a cadre, produce a cadre of administrators who know how to manage institutions, even if those don't have oratory, even if those are not the most beautiful, even if those are not the most convincing, the most eloquent, but they know how to work the system. They know how to maintain a public management system that works. They know a system that can work and bring business, bring civil society together. Those are the people who are administrators and are efficient in it. And they are allowed space to simply build systems that can work even without politicians in power. Thirdly, we need leaders But leaders are not people in position of leadership, but they are the leaders in positions of leadership. These are the people who know that their mandate, who have their passion to move things from where they were last week to where they should be the following week, who measure themselves on progress they can make in every week. That if you are a president of Kenya and you are the leadership of Kenya, you measure yourself on the extent to which the people of Kisumu have experienced progress this week, which was not there last week. Not 5 years, weekly, monthly progress. Those are the leaders because they lead the people towards something. They don't lead positions over a 5-year period. They are measured on what they can. They work on the basis of a dashboard that tells them it was red in this county this week. It's blue this week. They affirm themselves on turning the reds into blue every week, like a good and an efficient project manager. So we need to produce that leadership because it is that leadership, that administrator, and that citizen that will produce for us institutions that are resilient, that are efficient, and produce for us systems that work, and that can produce for us cultures that give us progress. Because if we're not able to change the system, the institutions and culture, we will go nowhere on whatever issue that we do. And lastly, therefore, we need an education system and a curriculum in the formal and informal system that can do the following, that can train mindset. We've had education system that can train biology, train engineering, that can train us in chemistry, that can train us in all sorts of things that produce qualification. But we now need one that can challenge people's mindset and make it unfashionable for someone to fail, and make it unfashionable for someone to lead and there's no change where they lead, and make it unfashionable for them not to impact people's lives positively. The mindset, somebody will change mindset to make them all believe that when all is said and done, their primary duty is to be agents of change and is to be the holders of destiny. Everything else they can lose. A training, secondly, that is about history training, which is to look at the history and draw lessons about what not to repeat and what to change and what to harvest from history. Not just to learn history as a story, but history as a platform of lessons. Thirdly, it must be a training that is training people for strategy, so that right through from age of 5 all the way to age of 30, people are trained how to develop strategy for any challenge that they face, so that wherever they do, they know that they are problem solvers, they are change makers. If we don't train that, we only train them to be good engineers, we're simply not solving our problem. Right now, Africa does not need engineers, does not need educators, does not need analysts, does not need economists, but it needs change makers. Fourthly, it must be training them with analytical skills that they need in order to identify what is the problem, why the problem is, and what can be done. Whatever else is for us not necessary. Because even a good mechanic must be the one who knows how to pick up what the problem is. But the problem is that in the entirety of leadership, we don't train people that way. And then the one before last of the skills that must be trained is change agency, which is to train people from the age of 5 all the way to age of 30 about how to engage each other in order to cause positive change that benefits everyone, whether they are in a church environment or they are in an NGO environment or in government. They must be trained not to do all these things, outputs and activities, no, but to think about how to change things for better. Because ultimately, it's with a change they cause in society that will help us make progress and not everything. And lastly, they need to be trained with the ability to understand leadership-citizenship interface, how leadership produces citizenship and how citizenship produces leadership. so that they don't think of leadership as something higher than citizenship or of things in hierarchy, but to see them as mutually influencing forces that must be managed all the time. When you have strong and efficient and active citizenship, then you will have responsible and accountable leadership, not as either or one against the other, but as necessary conditions to change things. And as you know, why Ghana and South Korea were the same stage in 1961, and why South Korea had an exponential growth and Ghana had a steady growth and a decline, was partly because Ghana lacked an active citizenship that would hold even a popular Nkrumah, not to the beauty of his words, but to the beauty of a road he built, to the beauty of a building he built, to the outcomes of education he built. That is what South Korea had. They don't measure citizenship only on their ability to vote, but on the ability to assist leaders to produce the change they do, including by asking difficult questions. So I really do think that it is possible for us to produce this kind of change mindset and change agency. And I think we can start to do it now. I think we should quit all these other things that we can do that are nice to do and urge each other to move a little closer to simply making a difference on a weekly basis in every space we have. And then the big outcomes will follow us. Maybe I'm daydreaming, but it is better to dream in the midst of despair than to keep facing despair perpetually. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for being long. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you so much, Professor Zondi. This is really very powerful insights you've shared with us. And I think they hit the proverbial nail on the head, because if we can be able even to do the 3/4 of what we just proposed here, our continent can definitely move in the right direction. Now, as we round up, I would like us to present one question that I would like every speaker to give us a thought in 2 minutes max. And this question is about what we really had to do here today. Taking stock, which we've done, and really I think we have delved into different sectors and trying to see what has worked and what hasn't, and what are the kind of impediments have been experienced in those various sectors. But I'd like us to capture some one or two main thoughts around the question of where to from here, especially as far as we all know, as our keynote speaker did mention in the beginning, that we're expecting some changes in the certain levels of leadership of the continental bodies. And I would like to pose this question to all panelists. We will end with Professor Zondi, and then we will start with Dr. Mohammed, followed by David, followed by Patience, and then Emmanuel, and then Professor Kapepe. I would like you to tell us in less than 5 minutes max, what should the next chairperson of the African Union or the African Development Bank or the executive secretary of the ECA be conscious about in their next term? What should the next chairperson of the African Union be more conscious about? 2 points each from our panelists as we round up. Right, can we start with Dr. Mohammed?
Yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Kariuki. I think two things. First one is the point that I made in my earlier submission. These continental leaders should domesticate, if you like, the policies of the continent. I think that is a good starting point, because a leader is not a leader without followers. And you cannot have an AU that is removed from the everyday African. So I think that is very fundamental to the success of the continental body. That is the first point that I would expect the new leadership of the continent to actually prioritize whilst doing all those other things. Because if citizens, African citizens, understand the importance of the continental body, then the interest of the AU and all other institutions will be at the back of their minds when they are electing their national leaders, so that they would now begin to look at a leader at home whose aspirations are in line with the Agenda 2063, for example, and all those other developmental blueprints and agendas that we have in the continent. But that is also connected to my second point, which is a follow-up, I guess, related to what Professor Zondo just spoke about, because democracy is not just a question of going to the ballot box and then casting a vote. The reason why we have adult suffrage, the reason why we don't allow 10-year-olds to go to the polling booth to vote is because at that age, we assume that they do not have the right information, the right knowledge, they do not have the faculty to understand a good policy, differentiate between a good policy and a bad policy. So that means that the problem is not just voting, but the impact of your vote. And that also means that before your vote can have impact, that the policies are at stake. So for people to actually have interest in the African Union, in the African Union or other continental bodies, for people to elect leaders who are Pan-African, not in their thinking and in their practice of politics, they have to know what it means to be African. They have to know the history, what happened yesterday, because without the past, the present is meaningless and the future is uncertain. Now, if we speak about the past, there's this tendency to think that we are so, glued to the past and that we do not want to move on. Now, you cannot separate the present from the past. And for you to be meaningful today, you have to know what happened in the past. So looking back is not to, obsess with looking back so that you stumble and fall going forward. It's looking back, using that hindsight to give you insight today so that you can have proper foresight. And that is what I think Africans should do on the individual level, on the community level, on the national level, on the regional level, and on the continental level. So first, domesticate our Agenda 2063. Now, if you go to Africa, we ask for sustainable development goals. I'm sure Africans will know more about sustainable development goals than they will about Agenda 2063. Why is that the case? It is because you look to the globe for relevance. Why don't we know more about the African Union? Why don't we know more about the Free Continental Free Trade Agreement that we have? Why don't we know more about the Africa peer review mechanism? Why don't we know more about these continental bodies? So knowledge, and then domesticating our institutions, because you cannot do without knowing. To do, you must know. So I guess I would stop there for others to continue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mohammed. That's very spot on. I think it really resonates with what we'll be able to compile together and we can share with the body of the African Union around this issue, because I think it's very spot on. You've got to get to know what went wrong to correct the future. At the same time, also need to domesticate these policies so that even citizens themselves within the member countries can be able to take advantage and be able to support a process, what Professor Zondo talked about, active citizenship. Thank you so much, Dr. Mohammed. Over to you, Mr. David, your 2 points of what the incoming chairperson of the AU should be thinking and focusing on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, brother. Let me just take it up from where he stopped on domestication. As you read from my brief, I manage a joint UNDP AU project on domestication, ratification, and implementation of African Union treaties. And we need to move beyond domestication to implementation, because that's where the difference is made. There are so many progressive normative frameworks that AU has adopted. Some of them have been mentioned here. So in addition to domesticating them, they should make effort to implement them. Change comes from. And they should also make efforts. I'm looking at the occasional changes of government that we have experienced in a number of countries. That proper sanctions should be there. Should be carrot and sticks, where people have gone foul of these normative frameworks, that they should be brought to order. It's not enough to strongly condemn. It's not enough to say you no longer come to our meetings. But I think they should go beyond that for people to know that there is a price to pay. One example, there is a provision in the AGDEC that when you change government or democratically, you overthrow government, that the African court could take you up. But I'm not sure if that has been done, so that anytime you leave government and you have been accused of removing a constitutionally constituted government, it remains an offense. It does not expire. That you should be tried so that people know that there is a price to pay. So it's only when you implement the instrument that people, get compensated plus minus, for doing the right or the wrong thing. The next is that these new persons should deploy existing structures. They are there. I'm thinking of the Panel of the Wise. I'm thinking of the Peace and Security Council. I'm thinking of the Silence. A lot of them are there. The early warning system that you could possibly have deployed to know that the peace in Sudan was going to be breached. For you to be proactive to deal with these things. So deploy those structures that have been established. The second, and I think my brother made reference to this, we need African Union of the people. What I think we have now is African Union of the state, where the people directly take part in the decisions. Because people come to Addis to argue, to debate, to take positions and decisions. But back home, nobody knows what has been done in Addis. No one is calling for implementation. No one is calling for anything to be done because they are not aware. Those conversations never took place back home. So we need effort to make AU of the people. If you go around Africa, you are likely going to hear people living in my village talk about EU because they can point to a renovation of a primary school with an EU, signboard somewhere, or water a project or something. But there is nothing to the name of AU anywhere in our communities. So it remains high-level government-to-government conversation. So they need to make effort to make it AU of the people. The last is funding. Like you heard, in my earlier remarks, the percentage that is covered by external actors. Someone said, one of the panelists, put your mouth where your money is, or put your money where your mouth is. So if you don't have money to implement these noble ideas, you become a project of another organization, another political institution. And when they fund you, they direct you. So I was in a meeting this morning and there was an agenda item pledging for ECBF. We have 40 member states. Only 3 member states stood up to say we commit 2 million for the next 5 years. Every other person that spoke, I'm going to Capital, I'm going to link up. But this was an agenda sent to everyone. So we were expecting that everyone would come to the meeting to say this is how much we are committing. So if AU member states are unable to fund the AU adequately and fund the peace operation, fund every other thing that they have designed to do to make for the Africa we want, then we remain beggarly. The resources are there. So purposeful leadership will make sure that we use our resources, utilize them for the development of the continent. Over.
Thank you so much, Mr. David. That's really, really powerful. And even picking up from that last point, if we do not be able to mobilize resources ourselves internally, somebody else will do it for us, but will dictate what we need to do with that money. And I think for all of us who have been to Addis, I think we really understand what that really means. And now lately, we saw that the FCTA headquarters, I think, ECOWAS headquarters in Nigeria being built by the Chinese. If we do not do it ourselves, somebody else is doing it for us, and with the cost can be very costly. Thank you so much, David. That is really awesome. Right. Let's go to Sister Achieng. Would you go for it and give us your two powerful thoughts? What would the incoming leader of the AU should focus? Over to you. Right. I hear Cheng, Mr. Cheng. Right. While we wait for Mr. Cheng to join us.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Yes.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Cheng.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can hear you. Go for it. Your 2 minutes.
Apologies, the internet. Yes, so I think my two remarks. My first one would be the necessity for courage. I think Africa would never have gotten where it is today without courage. And I think in addition to visionary leadership, I think courage is also lacking quite a bit in the way the AU is at the moment. Everybody seems to lack the courage to do something, and seems to just be, I don't know if it's fear of backlash or what the fear is, but we need leaders who have the courage to say enough is enough, or to say no. And I'm not talking just about at the heads of state level, but even within the institution of the AU. We need people who have the courage to speak up, like the women did a few years ago, what they called employment apartheid, as women were not being employed by the AU. But if they hadn't stood up, then there wouldn't be a policy to correct those issues. So just sometimes all that's needed is courage, not even resources, not even mechanisms, but just somebody to stand up, like Macky Sall did with Yahya Jammeh. He had the courage to say, no, you're not going to stay in power. And so sometimes that courage to stand up and say no is what we need. I think my second issue would be to repeat what Dr. Mohammed said, that Pan-Africanism and the AU as an institution of Pan-Africanism needs to be of value to people. People need to feel that this institution is actually responding to their needs, is catering to their challenges, and is making their lives easier. The aspirations, even if they're just aspirations of African peoples, should matter for something. The monies that have been spent into institutionalizing the African Union, we must account for it. So we now have a union of 55 states. What does it do? What value does it have in people's lives? And I think for me, that second issue is, if nothing else, the next chair should show value of the institution. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. Wonderful, powerful ideas there, Mr. Cheng. And I think they really do complement what Mr. David just said. I think we should, if there's one thing we could take out of this platform that is revolutionary, if I use that South African language, is to promote an African Union for citizens and not for member states, so that leaders do not have to meet and debate over the things that we are struggling with, and then perhaps maybe we need to invert the curve, an African Union for for citizens and Africans so that they can be able to say what needs to be said. And we need courageous leadership to promote active participation of citizens, African citizens, in these conversations to influence policy direction. Well done, and thank you so much, Mr. Cheng, for joining us. Now, we're going to Ms. Patience. Your two powerful ideas. What should the incoming African Union chairperson should focus on to make this a powerful institution relevant for African people and fit for purpose? Over to you.
Okay, thank you. So the first one is I would encourage the African leadership to focus on looking at the economic sectors that are crucial for growth of the African continent. So, and then we need to make sure that if you are going to be putting investment into those sectors, it's also focused on where we will achieve the most or huge impact. So I think that would be my first recommendation. Then the second one, it's having a localized solutions, African solutions for African people. So what do I mean by that? Most of the things that we've been told, I've talked about the issue about my grandmother. We've been told this works when we started using fertilizer, that synthetic fertilizers. But when you come back internally, there was what was working before that we also need to have a real look at and then say, why was it working? And then we then adopt on that. So we need African or localized solutions. If we are taking things from outside, then it also means we need to really look what change is it gonna bring? Is it gonna bring real change? Or some of them, they might be certain, they want to put certain agendas on Africa, which we also need to guard against. So those are some of the things that I would take to the next AU leadership. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Patience. I think that's also very powerful insights there. And I think the idea of localizing solutions driven by Africans for Africans is a very powerful insight, because as we began the conversation, when our keynote speaker did mention, whose development are we promoting on this continent? Because at this point, it doesn't show us if it's a development that is really relevant to African people. And therefore, we have all this host of challenges that we are experiencing because somebody else is dictating the path that we should follow. The trajectory does not seem to be aligned with the expectations and the aspirations of African people. Thank you so much. Those are very powerful insights. Now, we're going to Professor Kapepe, your 2 points.
Thank you so much. I think my few points are that in wrapping up are that we need a chair, we need experts in the body that are going to be Pan-Africanist in nature, who are forward-looking and progressive. The leadership that is self-sufficient, that's going to look at self-sufficiency of Africa, mobilizing our resources, making us own our resources again. Because right now we don't know who is owning our resources. So we must own our resources, mobilize resources for Africans. I want to buttress what Mr. David has said earlier on. I've worked on a number of community-based research in Zimbabwe, and most of them are funded by EU and none from African Union. So the leadership that's going to come should be able to make AU pervade into the rural areas, let everybody else, young and old, understand what AU means to us. We also, I suggest that we also need to be, to stop being nostalgic, that there's nostalgic preoccupation with the past and our past successes. You know, I think we tell stories about what we've achieved. We must look forward and start repositioning ourselves in pragmatic investment into the future of our children. You know, we need a leadership that's going to defy borders, artificial borders that were drawn by the colonizer. We need to allow the free movement of people and goods and skills from one country, African country, to another African country, and be able to share our expertise and be able to retain our skill. Because right now we are losing skill to the West, we are losing skill to our erstwhile colonizers. That's where we are going. And why is it that? It's because we are not being appreciated, we are not being allowed, we are circumscribed in a border that is drawn by the colonizer 200 years ago, you know. So people should be able to move from Cape to Cairo freely, you know. So that's my contribution going forward. We need experts in Africa Union.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Kapepe. Those are very powerful insights also. We must stem brain drain by all means, not only just of medical practitioners or medical professionals, but it's all professionals, you know, relocating from Africa or immigrating from Africa to the countries in the West. We must stop that if Africa must develop and become the continent we want to see as far as industrialization and its capabilities are concerned. And of course, the idea of freedom of movement, as Mr. Emmanuel did his presentation, only 3 or 4 countries have signed that protocol. What is happening to the rest 50? And on that note, I would like to invite Mr. Emmanuel back to the platform to share his 2 points. What should the incoming AU chairperson should focus on? Over to you, Mr. Emmanuel. Hello, Mr. Emmanuel, can you hear me? All right, while we wait for Mr.
Hello.
Oh, okay. Yes, can you hear us?
Yeah. Yes, I can hear you.
Right. Yes, what are your last 2 points of what should the incoming AU chairperson focus on?
So in my view, what I think the AU chairperson should focus going forward. Well, okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So largely, I think the AU chairperson should be a bit more committed on ensuring that there's a coherence around issues like migration, freedom of movement. I mean, the AU is the largest continental organization, if you think about it, around, and yet freedom of movement is poorly lacking. I think at the stage where we have gotten to with our integration, we made a lot of efforts on peace and security and whatever else. We just need to, sort out the rough edges. And the rough edge, especially now in the era of AfCFTA, is on migration. Its consequences, positive consequences of migration for AfCFTA are so clear. What it will do to GDP and so on. So I think the AU leader must begin to identify champions or people who are committed to ensuring that we get our freedom movement protocol ratified as quickly as possible, because I think the way in which it will change the continent once the protocol is signed will be incredible and will be very important for all of us. So I think we should put more efforts, more time, more thought into that. I think for me that's the biggest thing. Otherwise, everything else is still work in progress. There's still a lot more, much more to do. Even on peace and security, I like points that have been raised elsewhere, that even the whole conversation around that can be changed, especially with the number of peace missions, peacekeeping missions that are on the continent. The character of those peace missions can change, so that we get something that speaks to more comprehensive development post-conflict, rather than one that is just routing those who are called, as we've been seeing. AMISOM has come to remind us. The former African Union mission in Somalia has come to remind us of how not to do conflicts. So I think even that too, there needs to be some progress on that, efforts on that. But definitely, for me, the biggest thing should be peace and security. Should be a freedom of movement. Thank you.
Great stuff. Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Emmanuel. I think that's a very well said point that we have really listened to today, and I think it makes a lot of sense. And I see Professor Zondi is making a point here that we must be talking about something that the chairperson can do in a year, because they only serve a year only. So there's something that they can do within the limited time period that they are in office. I think that's something to take note of. And I'm sure some of these things can be done within that period of time with proper consultation and support from the other African leaders who are part of his leadership, or whoever will take over from there. Right, now we have Professor Zondi to share his two things that he thinks that the incoming leader should focus on within the limited time constraints.
Paul, you are setting us up for failure. Because, you had any discussion and I was listing the things that I do. Then I realized that I'm asking them to do things that require a decade, but they will only have 11 months to do what I need them to do. So then I realized at the time the mistake we also, who are civil society analysts and others, the mistake we made. I was almost going to say he must harmonize policy. Hey, you can't harmonize policies even in 5 years. You're asking them to do in 1 year. They don't also have power. The AU does not have, the AU chairperson only has power to convene and bring together and encourage and push things in a particular way. So you're putting me in a risk of proposing what is impossible for them to do. So I'm setting them up to fail. So I'm going to say this. What an AU chairperson can do in a year is to build a stronger relationship between the office of the chairperson and the office of the AU chairperson, AU Commission chairperson, and at least agree that there must be a method of work that is stronger, that they can do in a year. The second thing they can do is that, given that there is already a decision about what to be done, what is called the Kagame report that was adopted, is to identify out of those 17 things they do, what is the one they can get started with in 2024 that might then be carried over to 2025. It might be something very small, such as institutionalized performance management system, a performance management system that every AU chairperson who comes in there will use in their conversation with the chairperson of the AU Commission and the commissioners. So there is something that they can use to measure the performance of an AU chair, rather than just an open conversation. If the chairperson next year starts that process, then they would have created a legacy for the other AU chairperson to use, so that they have a structured relationship between the AU chairperson and the AU Commission chairperson. And that is where I would rest it, because I think those are achievable in a year in the office. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Zondi. I think it really makes perfect sense. And thank you for recalibrating us to think that way, because it's very important to know that these people are also not there for eternity. They have a very limited time. And some of these issues, as we've raised and the points we're proposing, they are all useful and powerful, but perhaps within the time constraints of their office, term of office, cannot be done. So I agree with you 100% in terms of institutionalizing performance management. I think that is really what is lacking in the entire setup of that institution. Then rarely do you hear anything to do with progress, except something very humongous that we've planted trees here and there, and we've managed to do, to set up a framework for this and the other, but really not tangible results. And therefore, the handing over process from one AU chairperson to the next is really not based on things that have been achieved. It's really based on the outcome of an election process of who succeeds the other one. So thank you so much, Professor Zondi. That is really very powerful. And I want to, at this stage, to give a colleague here, Ms. Hazel Khumalo, a vote of thanks. But before I give Ms. Hazel Khumalo the floor, I want to thank all of you panelists for being able to share this useful time with us and be able to share your insight. I really enjoyed myself, and I hope you did yourself too. And thank you so much again, Dr. Charles. Over to you, Hazel.
Thank you so much, Paul. I hope you all can hear me and see me. I'll be very quick. I I just want to give so much gratitude to the panel and the team that has facilitated this show. This has been jam-packed, so informative, and it's making us run on our heels to sort our Africa. Special thanks goes to our keynote speaker, Mr. David Obozo-Ufo, our facilitator, Dr. Paul Kariuki, then our panelists, which constitutes Ms. Patience Samuta, Professor Oliver Kapepa, Mr. Ike Bansa, Professor Zondi Sipamandla, and Dr. Mohammed Suleiman. Great gratitude to Dr. Suleiman, because he's up, it's almost midnight, I'd like to think. We appreciate your dedication and you being here at this time. And lastly, Ms. Achieng Akena, for her wonderful contribution. I just want to allude quickly to something that David mentioned earlier on as we started this. He mentioned that this platform should be maintained. This conversation must continue, and we're delighted to do so as a team. Paul and his team from DDP also mentioned that that there's a lot that has emerged from this conversation, and we should hopefully make this a monthly conversation so that it's until we get the right leaders for the AU, African Development Bank, and the Economic Commission for Africa. And we plan to do so as a team, collectively. After this, what we're planning to do is we're going to compile these proceedings into a report, which we're going to share to all team members, and also get your permission and feedback and approval. Then we can collectively, as a team, the panel, everybody, decide on the next step. The reason why we want to do that is because we don't want to end this as a talk. We're talking about problems in a talk show. We want to have implementable solutions, and collectively so. Finally, I would like to give great thanks as well to the DDP team who's made this very possible. Who's made this very possible for us. Sarushka, who's been administratively running this particular platform for us. Paul and the rest of his team who have been doing a lot of phenomenal work behind. And I'd also like to thank Ms. Janice Grandy, who's also been helping us administratively. And finally, our social media guru, Ms. Alida Chinda. Thank you so much for being a part of this journey. We've absolutely enjoyed it, and we look forward to interacting with you all a whole lot more. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good day.